A federal judge has rejected the challenge that landlords posed against the city of St. Paul, Minnesota's rent control law. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. All right, so I have an interesting update for you today, and it's going over the lawsuit that landlords had filed against the city of St. Paul, Minnesota's rent control law. So the rent control law in St. Paul, Minnesota was one of the most strict rent control laws to have ever passed across the entire country. And it capped rent increases at 3%. It didn't look at inflation. It didn't exempt new construction. It didn't allow landlords to have any way to get out of it, right? And so what did they do? They immediately filed lawsuits saying, hey, this is a violation of our due process rights. And they thought maybe if we push this up to the federal courts, we can get some sort of relief. Well, it doesn't look like that happened. But in between the time that they filed the lawsuit and right now, there's been some other changes as well. They've made modifications and some exemptions to the rent control law. But regardless of whether there's a few modifications or exemptions, the law still is garbage, in my opinion, okay? It hurts the landlords there, it hurts development there, and it will make it very difficult to operate a business there, no matter if you are falling under one of these exemptions or if you're not, okay? So they need to just get rid of it completely. I don't like rent control laws. The majority of landlords don't like them. And yes, some can operate under them, but that doesn't mean that they are good for the long term, okay? They are bad news for the long term. So before I get into the article, go ahead, hit the like and subscribe button, maybe leave a comment down below and let me know what you think. So did you expect the federal judge to have, basically thrown out this lawsuit by the landlords? I didn't, okay? Honestly, I was hopeful that the federal judge would make a wise decision and agree with the landlords and get rid of this rent control law, but, it looks like that's not what happened. Now, I don't know what the next step in the process is, if they can push their federal lawsuit up to the Federal Appeals Court or possibly the Supreme Court, but maybe it'll say more details of what exactly is going to happen next in the article. So let's get into it. This article is coming from menlawyer.com, and it says, U.S. judge rejects challenge to St. Paul's rent ordinance. All right, well, let's see what the article says. Landlords filed suit against the city of St. Paul last year, alleging that the city's rent control ordinance violated their due process rights, as well as the contract clauses of the Minnesota and U.S. constitutions. U.S. District Judge Nancy Brazel disagreed and granted the city's summary judgment request on Monday. The dispute arose out of a rent ordinance enacted by St. Paul in 2022. On November 2nd, 2021, St. Paul voted to limit monthly rent increases to just 3% in any 12-month period, even when tenants move out. Landlords who fail to comply are subject to civil and criminal penalties, including serving 90 days in jail. At the time, the rent control ordinance was one of the strictest in the nation. Only a handful of states have localities with some sort of rent control ordinance. Yeah, strictest in the entire nation, okay? And here we're talking about Minnesota here, okay? We're not talking about the East Coast. We're not talking about California. It kind of is surprising. I mean, not too surprising. It's pretty liberal up there within the Twin Cities, at least within the cities of St. Paul and Minneapolis themselves. And so I'm not that surprised that they were able to get something like this passed. I'm more surprised that they didn't have like a statewide law that banned rent control from even being implemented, because, these kind of policies, they are, they steal, or not steal. Well, yeah, they do steal. They steal money from landlords, right? But they destroy new development. They make it very, very hard and expensive for anyone to develop. So, you know what? People just say, hey, I'm not dealing with it. I believe that there was a rent control policy in Boston, Massachusetts a long time ago. And the development just stopped because of it, right? And there was no development for like over a decade of any new construction. And they were like, well, what's going on? Why is there no new construction? Well, it was the rent control policy. And so after they finally figured that out, they banned rent control within the state of Massachusetts. So I imagine that they think that, oh, if we put these exceptions in there, if we put these these little things in there, that will prevent the worst case scenario of there being no development. But it could create a almost as bad scenario where you have a lot of development that's being created, right? But it's only in the extreme high ends. There's no, middle, there's no lower income stuff. There's just the super high end stuff. That's what you're seeing up in places like New York and San Francisco. Developers can't make any money off of, just regular housing. So what they're doing is they're only building the, extreme high income housing. Yeah. That's the only way they can make money. Yeah. They've taken away the landlords' incentives to, make money. And so when we have a limited income coming in, we're going to cut our costs in other places. And that's going to be in maintenance. That's going to be in capital expenditures. That's going to be in updating our properties when we have tenant turnover. Okay. So properties are going to fall into disrepair a lot quicker. Anyway, let's continue. 2 plaintiffs contested the ordinance. Lofts at Farmers Market and Woodstone Limited Partnership, who owns an interest in Woodstone Apartments, filed a 59-page lawsuit in the U.S. District Court for Minnesota. Woodstone Limited Partnership bought its property over 30 years ago. When it bought the property, it had no reason to expect that it would be subject to rent control legislation, as Minnesota Statute 471.9996 preempts rent control legislation unless it is approved by voters in a general election. Woodstone argued that St. Paul enacted a 15% hard cap on rent increases by landlords, granted exemptions from the 3% limit, which was not approved by voters. The Lofts at Farmers Market acquired the building after years of being operated by St. Paul. However, plaintiff Lofts alleged that the building had been much more costly to operate than what had been represented, as property taxes increased by double the estimates. Both plaintiffs claim that raising rent higher than 3% is necessary to make a profit. And they're absolutely right. It will be necessary in order to make a profit. As you know, inflation for the last couple of years has been over 8%. Yet they're saying, oh, you got this 3% cap, you got this 3% cap. The worst part about rent control is it's not means tested, okay? So you're talking about, oh, we want to make sure that people who are lower income can afford this housing. Well, what about the people who are renters who are not lower income? Why do they need to have cheaper housing? They don't, okay? You created this law in order to get votes because, simply put, it's not actually going to help the people who need it. The people who need housing, they're not going to be able to find housing because people are going to be holed up in their units for as long as possible with their super cheap rent. And, there's going to be a mismatch between the types of units available and the types of units that people need. Okay, so you'll end up with like old couples who live by themselves, old person who lives by themselves, living in a 4-bedroom apartment because they have it under rent control for the last 30 years and the rent is super cheap. But meanwhile, there's a family of 4 and they can't get a 3-bedroom apartment, okay? So yeah, this is the kind of nonsense that rent control creates, and this is part of the reason, but the main reason is that landlords should have the right and the opportunity to make a profit off of their business, and they shouldn't be forced to provide subsidized housing for people when we aren't a social service provider. We aren't a homeless shelter. That's not our responsibility. If the government wants to take that role, then they need to pay the landlord the fair market rent, okay? Or they can just let the market do what the market is supposed to do, which is, rents or whatever the supply and demand says they are. Calling the ordinance draconian and procedural straitjacket, Woodstone Limited Partnership and Lofted Farmers Market LLC filed the 59-page original lawsuit in U.S. District Court for the District of Minnesota on June 16th of 2022. It asked the court to strike down the ordinance, or at minimum, strike down the 15% cap on rent. The plaintiffs argued that while there was a process to get an exemption, it was unclear and unpredictable. They alleged that there were only 3 employees who made the decisions and that none of them had experience in the residential leasing industry. And see, that's the other problem. When you put people in charge of getting an exemption who have no clue what our costs are, no clue what our business model is, no clue what it takes to get a loan, and they are the ones who get to decide how much you're able to raise your rents. I might have to double my rents. I mean, literally, increase my rents by 100% in order to bring them up to the market rate in order to pay for the renovations that I am putting into the building. I might have to do that, okay? And there shouldn't be some bureaucrat, because you put the wrong person in there. You know, some bleeding heart who feels bad, and they'll be like, "Oh yeah, you spent $5 million doing updates to your building, but we're not going to allow you to have any rent increase because these tenants, they're still suffering from COVID." You know, that's the kind of nonsense that we hear, and I'm sick of it. Okay, so yeah, I feel bad for landlords up in St. Paul. But, you know, what my suggestion still is, right, and this is the suggestion I've made every single video. St. Paul, you know, they're the only city in that little area that has rent control. You know, you can invest in any of the suburbs, any of the outside counties, you know, anywhere else in the state of Minnesota, and you don't have to worry about rent control. You can build your buildings there. You can buy rental properties in the city that is literally right next to St. Paul and not have to deal with this nonsense. And that's exactly what I would do.